Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site that covers, of course, your Arizona Cardinals. We're episode 547, and with me in this edition of the show is fellow CardsWire reporter and writer Howard Balzer, also from the NFL Wire, CardsWire. He's been doing work with me for the past few months. And has been at minicamp, at OTAs, at some of the recent press availabilities. Howard, glad to have you on as we hit a tough part of the offseason in terms of content, but it's been kind of nice because the Cardinals have, something new that in these off weeks since minicamp, and with the exception of next week, which is a holiday week, they bring in a coach, a couple of coaches, a couple of players, to fill in the gaps, which I greatly appreciate. I'm sure you do too.
No doubt. It's been really good over these last few weeks, getting, two people each week to talk to. And obviously it creates a lot of content. And the thing that hit me leaving the facility today after we talked with Drew Petzng is that, like you said, there won't be anything next week because it's a holiday. We presume there will be something the next week, which guess what? That's the week before training camp starts. So it shows how close it really is, right around the corner. And then it'll be out to Glendale pretty much on a regular basis when camp begins. And I think there's a lot of people looking forward to that. And a lot of the fans, too, to get out there and see this, new version of the Cardinals.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Right now, we just get to talk about what's happening around the list. This is the list and rankings time of year, so we're going to see the NFL Network's top 100. We're seeing rankings from Touchdown Wire and all about the other publications. But we do, and this is a kind of a repeat of topic, but since I've got Howard, we can get his take on it. We want to talk about Kyler Murray again because, of course, for some reason, after 2 years of building up the reputation of Kyler Murray, the old stuff had to be brought back up. But at the same time, we're getting MVP talk. It's that time of year. No one thinks that Kyler Murray's a favorite to win MVP, but we've got some data from Howard in terms of, even if Kyler has a very good statistical year, we have some data about it's not just about the numbers. So Howard, let's go ahead and get started. Seth and I talked about on the last show what we thought about the stuff that Colin Cowherd brought up, the idea that there is still a stigma about him or whatever it seems to be, that Kyler seems to be one of the least supported good quarterbacks in his market that we can find in the NFL.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. And I think there's a certain amount of that lack of support outside of the market, too. There just has always seemed to be this, trying to think of the right word for it. There's certainly people who support him and like him and feel that he's obviously very talented. And even Colin Cowherd said that in what he talked about. He talked about how talented he believes Kyler is. But then there's all that, talk about the off-field stuff. Is he a leader? The whole video game issue, which really, reared its ugly head with the contract a couple of years ago with the independent study clause, and that he would have to put in a certain amount of hours before he watched TV or played video games or things like that. And I remember at one point, Jess, there was someone who did a study and showed how Kyler's play tailed off in some seasons after the release of the new Call of Duty in October. Well, of course, his play in those years also tailed off because he got injured. And there were other factors.
And DeAndre Hopkins got hurt, and James Conner got hurt, and Chase Edmonds got hurt.
I think the one thing that, and I alluded to this in what I wrote, was that what Cowherd said was there probably, on certain people's minds, there probably is this stigma attached to them. I don't know if it's a huge stigma. I think a certain amount of it is unwarranted. And as I noted, I mean, Kyler Murray's not a guy who goes out partying, with people. He's not a guy who's out till 2 a.m. clubbing. He's kind of a homebody. And so, is. Yeah, exactly. And as we've seen, especially over these last 18 months, in terms of what he's had to do to rehab the knee, learn the offense, all that. Well, you know what? If he's at the facility for all those hours every day, rehabbing the knee and then learning the offense and all that, so what if he plays video games for a couple of hours at night? Well, I mean, when Colin kept using the word addicted to video games, I mean, what does that even mean? What's an addiction? I mean, right. it was just
that's like, bizarre. I know, like, if someone talked to Colin about what he said, Colin himself did not say Kyler had a problem. He said that there is a stigma about it, that there are studies that therapists say that gamers are bad for marriages, whether it's because of the gaming or because of the stigma that goes along with gaming. Like, once you hit adulthood, you get past college and you're still a regular gamer, there is the idea of, oh, you're immature, you need to do real stuff. And whether or not that young man or young woman is doing those things, the idea that playing video games instead of doing something more productive, it sounds like my mother when in the 1990s when we were allowed to play 30 minutes of video games a day during the summer each. That 30 minutes was our limit. And it was different because, like, the thing now, video gaming, like gaming, is highly social. It's how you get together with your friends. And let's be honest, we haven't actually heard anything about Kyler's gaming in about 2 years, because it was about 3 years ago. It was about 3 years ago that he joined the FaZe clan, and I believe that's kind of where it became a big deal, that he was monetizing the esports side of his, and he's always been one to say he wishes he doesn't think he should be limited. Like, if he had a choice, he would probably play both baseball and football and do e-gaming, esports as well, because, the guy who's super competitive, he doesn't believe in limiting himself. But the fact of the matter is, we haven't heard anything in the last 2 years about how much he's gaming or not, because, and I think it all kind of stems from the fact that there were people within the organization feeding national reporters this criticism, these true or just minor things about Kyler's character. And that's the biggest thing I took away, is that what Colin was saying is that, around the league, execs around the league, fans in Arizona, they're like, nope, I don't believe, they don't trust Kyler. They don't believe in him. And that even, and I know that Steve Keim, which is highly ironic, Kyler Murray made Steve Keim in those last 4 years. And it's the same thing, because I've always believed that everything that the Cardinals had in terms of success after the Steve Wilkes, after Cliff Kingsbury took over, was because of Kyler and the fact that Steve Keim or his office would leak such detrimental things about the franchise quarterback. Of course that would put him at odds with the organization. Of course he would decide to work out alone in Texas if he did not believe that what was happening in the building was conducive to winning.
And those are all good points. And I think also that we have to give a little slack to the off-season aspect of it, because in Kyler's second year was the pandemic. So there was no off-season. No one was in the building. Same thing pretty much.
Well, in 2021, the NFLPA was saying 2 players don't. And Kyler was just lockstep with the veterans in the building.
And I've always said that the one thing overlooked somewhat in that controversial new contract, overlooked aside from the independent study clause, were the huge off-season bonuses that the team put in his contract as an incentive for him to be there. And I always thought, well, why would you have to incentivize a guy with over $1 million, $1.5 million for showing up at the offseason program?
I have a theory of that, and it goes along with study clause, that it wasn't necessarily that. And I think both of those were a Bidwill thing. And it was, this is the biggest contract the Bidwill family had ever given out. And so knowing what, so we expect this of you, so we're going to put money into it. Whether or not, and I think some of it was a reaction to what was being said to the public. He was reacting to public comments, which whether or not might have been true. It's true. Basically, the only time Kyler was, you could criticize Kyler for not participating in the offseason program was in 2022, and that was all about the contract, which is a common thing. Nick Bosa did this the very next year. Brandon Ayuk's been doing it. Is standard operating procedure for players who are in a who are looking for an extension. That's absolutely normal. But I think it was a case of there is part of Kyler that still needed to grow into the leadership role of a franchise quarterback. And so Bidwill, whether or not, I'm sure Kyler would have done it anyway, Bidwill kind of wanted to make sure that there were a number of things. Okay, well, we expect you to be here, so we'll pay you this. Or maybe that was the agent saying, well, if you want us here, pay us. Like, if you want him to be here, show that you want him there and incent him to be there, and then he'll have every reason to be there. That's the quiet thing. It's the quiet thing that no one's been saying, that very few people have been saying about why Budda Baker was in all the offseason work this year without complaining. You know, Monty put in his contract $400,000 in a workout bonus.
Yeah, exactly. And he wasn't there last year. He wasn't there for OTAs. He was present for the mini camp, but didn't go on the field. And so that was all, like you said, a big part of it. And the one thing, Jess, we'll never know what would have happened, where things would be right at this moment had Kyler not torn his ACL at the end of the 2022 season. Because who knows, suppose that doesn't happen and they end up winning 2 or 3 games down the stretch, and they've got 6 or 7 wins instead of 4.
And then they keep rolling.
Cliff Kingsbury get fired
with Cliff still leading.
You don't know that.
That's always the great what if. A lot of things is, well, did that play? Because the 2022 was a disaster. It was. It went from they went from being bad, and then the absolute worst thing that could happen was like, just Kyler stay healthy, and then he tears his ACL in December. So that he wouldn't be able to do anything till at least midseason the next year. It was just highly frustrating, but it led to, the circumstances led to what appears to be a positive thing, which brings us to coming up next on the Rise of Sierra podcast, the Best Cardinals Talk. We will discuss more about Kyler Murray, but the good stuff. That's coming up next on Rise of Sierra. We're back on the Rise Up Sea-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Continuing our talk about Kyler Murray, just like the other show when we and Seth were talking, he's kind of the same format. We talked about the criticism, but now we've got, he came on strong. He was healthy over the final 8 games of the season. Statistically across the board, it was pretty above average, pretty, pedestrian for a solid starting quarterback. But really what we saw is over the last 3 or 4 games that his play really took off, and that was without any sort of contributions from the receiving core. It was basically the Kyler, Connor, and Trey offense, and they were still incredibly effective. This offseason, you get Michael Wilson in year 2. You get a greater role for Greg Dortch. They signed Zay Jones, and most importantly, they draft Marvin Harrison Jr., whom many believe will be a star even in year 1. And that, I think it's almost unfair, but kind of the expectations is that Harrison will have the type of rookie season that Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase had in terms of impact. But that's led to small little rumblings of now Kyler Murray as a dark horse MVP. NFL.com's Jody Batista talked about it. Trey McBride. I know that the interview that led to that was because of that article by Judy Batista. Trey McBride expressed his confidence that he's like, yeah, he could be an MVP. It isn't that simple, though, right? It's not as simple as Kyler being great statistically, which thus far in his career, I think that's one of the things that's held him back in terms of the public view. when Kyler was drafted, the type of player that he was, people were expecting mad fantasy numbers. I think they were expecting Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes type fantasy numbers where he's throwing for 4,000 yards, rushing for nearly 1,000, between 30 and 40 total touchdowns between passing and rushing. And he just hasn't had that. Like there were glimpses of it, but he's a guy who doesn't need the video game stats. He's content with simply winning games. That said, you've looked at some research about MVP races, and that MVP, in addition, and perhaps greater impact on MVP voting, isn't just the stats, but it's the wins. What did you find that we also can find already on CardsWire?
I mean, it was interesting because I had researched this almost 4 years ago when DeAndre Hopkins came here. And he was bringing up at the time when the Cardinals were playing good football before that season kind of turned the other way, a large part because of Kyler's shoulder injury. And to me, as an aside, I think one of the most important things in the last 8 games last season, aside from what he did on the field, was that he stayed healthy. Because so many of those other seasons, when he was being talked about as a potential MVP contact or a potential MVP, was that seasons went south because of a lot, partially because of injuries to him and injuries to other players. But when Hopkins brought that up in 2020, I thought to myself, well, let me look this up. And so I researched it then of what the average wins were for the play on the team that the player won the MVP. And it was right around 13, a little bit higher. And so now that this MVP talk came in again, I said, well, you know what? I got to update my stats, right? I got to update my stats from 2020 and 21, 22, and 23 since then. And it stayed relatively the same. And I don't remember how many years I went back then. I think it might have been just a decade of the 2000s. But this time I just went back 20 years and went back to 2004 and looked at the guys who won. And the average is right there at 13 victories per season for the quarterback on the team where the quarterback won the MVP. And I believe it was eight seasons where a team won 14 or more. And so that basically says if you're going to be, now there were some obviously less than 13, but you better, first of all, you have to win at least 10. Nobody's ever won less than 10 and been the MVP. There's only one guy with 10 that did, and that was on Adrian Peterson coming off a torn ACL.
What's one of the most special seasons we've ever seen from a running back.
For almost 2,100 yards. So he's the only one with 10. After that, everyone's 11, 12, and then the other numbers, as we mentioned. So it definitely coincides with team success because there's going to be a bunch of teams in the league that are going to have 12, 13, who knows, maybe 14 wins. And then most of the time it'll come back to the quarterback on that team that essentially wins it because there'll be enough really good quarterbacks with that many wins that are worthy. And that's the way it's been. Lamar Jackson last year, team won 13. Patrick Mahomes the year before, team won 14. Previous 2 years, Aaron Rodgers won 2 years in a row. Packers won 13 each season. So you better have the wins if you're going to even have a chance to get support in that. So it all comes down to how the Cardinals play. And we have to believe, Jess, that if the Cardinals are in, I don't know that anybody really expects that to happen, but if something would come together and all of a sudden this team plays well and stays healthy all throughout the roster, if all of a sudden they would win 12 or 13 games, well, a lot of it's going to be because of Kyler Murray.
It'll absolutely be because of Kyler, though the idea of the winter of 12, 13 games feels really, really funny. Like even myself, one of the most incredible, optimistic, positive guys when it comes to projecting things for the Cardinals. I think, best case scenario this year, that they're reaching their absolute peak would be about 10 wins, I think. And even if they won 10 wins, that would be remarkable. And I think he would be, I don't think he'd win MVP, but I believe, unless it's a down year for quarterbacks across the board, but I believe he would get MVP votes. At least that. He would get, if the Cardinals can make the playoffs, if they can get to that 10 win, which I don't think they will. Like I think they'll hit I think they will just miss the playoffs this year. But if they hit that 10-win mark, Kyler has, 4,000 passing yards for the first time in his career, and he rushes for 500 or 600, and they win 10 games. And because we know the defense isn't going to be great, we can assume there'll be improvement, but last year, after being atrocious, we can't expect them to go from atrocious to good. It's going to be from atrocious to, maybe tolerable. They're going to need Kyler to be a great player this year, and even then, I think it'll just be enough for him to get MVP votes and not the MVP award, because I think there's going to be, whether that's a Brock Purdy who's going to put up, it feels like, unless things fall apart, Brock Purdy's going to have massive numbers again this year. Patrick Mahomes is going to have, I think the additions to the receiver room there in Kansas City will be great for Patrick Mahomes. If Aaron Rodgers comes back from his injury, then the Jets are successful. All eyes are going to be on him. There's a number of quarterbacks, and then you even go to like Tyreek Hill, who was kind of an MVP candidate with a special receiving season last year. There's going to be that. C.J. Stroud, if he can replicate what he did late last season over the course of a full year, that there's going to be a number of players that you're going to consider before Kyler. But if he gets any MVP votes this year, that will mean the Cardinals probably overachieved what people expect.
Yeah, no question about it. And I think that if they can get to 10 wins, then all of a sudden you've won 6 more, and he has not necessarily a spectacular year, but it'll be looked at in terms of MVP is that, well, look at what the Cardinals did, and they did it on Kyler Murray's shoulders. So there will be some votes, and let's remember now, with the way the voting is done, unlike years ago, now for several years, the voting, where in the past the voters only picked one player as their MVP of the 50 voters, and so it was dominated by just, a couple guys normally. Well, now you put five guys on the ballot. And so all of a sudden there's more chances for other players to get, some support. And if it happens to be one of those years where there's a lot of really good players, and I think it was almost trending that way last year, where it looked like there was going to be a bunch of candidates, and then Lamar Jackson, with the way the Ravens played, he kind of ended up, running away with it. But you never know how that is going to go. And the other part, though, too, in terms of improvement, and we've seen this at times when teams all of a sudden get from one level to the other pretty quickly, because in the NFL with so many close games. I mean, look how many people have said, Jess, last season, Cardinals won 4, and people said, if they had Kyler Murray the first half of the year, they might have won 7.
Honestly, they should have won. They should have won 7. They should have beat Washington. They choked away the Giants game, and they missed a game-winning field goal against Seattle. Those are 3 games they should have won.
Exactly. So if you enter, and this is the way I look at it, if you enter December with whatever there is left at that point, 5 or 6 games, and you're even then right around the 500 level, if you're 5-5 or 6-5, something like that, and all of a sudden you win some games there coming in, and you're in the hunt for a playoff spot. All of a sudden you roll off a few wins in a row. Boom! All of a sudden you could get to 10 or 11. Now again, I'm not predicting it, but in this league where the line of victory is so slim and there are so many close games, you start gaining confidence. You start winning some of those close games and making those plays in the fourth quarter. And let me say this too, what you said about the defense. If you're playing good enough offense, and especially with the way this team can play with running, with passing, all the different things they can do, you keep your defense off the field, just by that alone, you're going to you would think you're going to improve it and get some leads in games, and that's going to help the defense as well. So I think we'll see improvement from this defense. What the level is, who knows? There's a lot of questions and a lot of unknowns, but I think this defense can get after people. And if the offense is playing good enough to control the ball, then I think that's going to help the other side of the ball.
Coming up next on the Rise of Zero podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talking Away. We've got one segment left that we're going to talk about, and that's after offensive coordinator Drew Petzing addressed the media on Thursday. What do we take away from that? That's coming next on Rise of Zero. We're back on the Rise of Zero podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Howard and I were both at the press conference on Thursday held but with offensive coordinator Drew Petzing, and he was peppered with all sorts of questions, whether it was Kyler Murray. He joked about needing 2 balls, seeing how he fooled Kyler into thinking he's a genius. He talked about a number of players. So, Howard, what were some of the biggest takeaways that you got when we spoke with Drew on Thursday?
I'll tell you, I have really enjoyed, listening to him. Last year, of course, he would meet with the media every week during the regular season. And I enjoyed listening to him and his approach to the game. To me, it sounds, I wish he would talk a little slower, but having said that, I think the way he talks about the game, he's humble. I think Kyler called him a genius. Trey McBride called him very smart. You can see that he is. I don't think there's any dumb coordinators in the NFL. And the one takeaway, though, is when he talked about the enjoyment of putting together a game plan and the collaboration with the coaches and the challenges of that on a week-to-week basis, and then acknowledged when he was asked, well, how much easier is that, or how much more fun can that be when you have the pieces in the offense to really feel you can put together a game plan that has a lot of weapons and a lot of different things you can do. And he said something that I'll never forget that Dick Vermeil said after the Rams won the Super Bowl in 1999. And before that season, people were talking about him being fired. And he said, hey, I became a much better coach when I had better players. And that's pretty much exactly. And that's what Drew Petzing said. He says, I'm a much better play caller when I've got really good players.
And that plays out really well in the locker room when that soundbite gets out, because he's saying our success is because of players. It shows the players that the coach doesn't think that he's smarter than the guys on the field. Like, it's his job to put them in position, but that's the sort of thing that really goes over well, because rather than, you hear a coach saying we put together a good plan and we didn't execute it, he's saying I look better when there's better players because they do things, and it's my job to make sure that those good players can do good things.
And I think the other part, in terms of when he joked about needing 2 footballs, was when he then said that a lot of times the quarterback, then he was asked, well, is there a worry that some players are going to be upset if they're not getting the ball, about spreading the ball around? He said, well, you can't worry about that because you just got to do what the game plan tells you to do. And then he said, but he's had the conversation with Kyler, because some quarterbacks especially will say, the pressure's on. I got to make sure to get the ball to that guy. And he says, no, don't worry about that. That's my job. That's my job. You just go where you should with the ball, make good decisions, and everything will take care of itself. But then the other factor, I think, that's really hanging, when you say hanging over a team, it has a negative connotation. So I don't know what the best word is, but I think the overall view of this team in terms of what Monty Ossenfort has put together with his talent acquisition in the last 18 months is the kind of players that are all about winning. And that's what Petzing talked about today. It's all about winning. And he says, so players want to be on winners. And so if all of a sudden you're maybe not getting the ball as much as you like, and he loves players who want the ball because they believe that that'll help the team win. But he said players will be fine with it and they'll want to be here if you're winning.
That is absolutely, absolutely the case. That's the big thing with the message
says,
that Jonathan Gannon has. It's working right now because they're making progress. But if they stall, that message won't sound as good. As long as they keep progressing, players will be bought in.
No doubt. And he said, I think the players we have are not going to have an issue with it. Now, obviously, like you said, everybody's optimistic on June 27th, right? Yeah, everybody is. But you really look at this and you can see that there's reason to be optimistic. So much of it does revolve around health and all those things. But I think it looks to me like there's pretty good depth on this roster. You're going to get injuries. I mean, you just can't avoid them totally. And so you better have guys who can step up. But your key players have to stay healthy.
Yes, always.
And that's always so important for any team. It sounds trite and a cliche, and I know there's some people all teams have injuries. You have to be over.
Right. Well, if Trey
man up.
McBride misses 2 games, that's different than Trey McBride missing 8 games. You can handle like your best players missing a game or 2. It just becomes problematic when you have multiple guys missing 4 they end up on injured reserve and things like that. And if you look at the depth overall, you like what you have at running back already. You like what the receiver room looks like right now, because it feels like you have 4 guys that you can absolutely trust to make plays. And nobody's talking much about Zay Jones. He's been a productive receiver. How they'll use him is going to be a question mark. But when you've got Harrison, Michael Wilson, Zay Jones, and Greg Dortch, who seems to make plays every time he's on the field, you've got 4 receivers that you feel really good about and you can trust. And so if somebody has to miss a game or 2, you're still left with 3. Trey McBride goes the same thing. Elijah Higgins showed enough promise last year that if Trey goes down, that you could get I think you probably could get a game or 2 of pretty, solid production from him. The offensive line appears to have more depth, especially on the interior. You don't feel as good as if Paris and Jonah Williams get hurt, because you've got Kelvin Beachum, who you can trust for a game or 2, but you don't want to test that depth further. But yeah, offensively, the depth feels really good, and you can weather a minor injury or 2 or 1 decent injury and like that. And I like one of the things that I'm fascinated by that we haven't heard from Say is that if you look at the pedigree, if you look at his background, he's a guy that worked under Stefanski, like the guys that influence him, Stefanski, who comes from Shermer, who comes from Andy. This is outside, this is a modern West Coast, traditional West Coast offense that he runs. And we've, Andy Reid's offense, which is a West Coast-based offense that has modern concepts to it for spread. Those offenses have been successful for decades.
No, you're 100% right. And so, and I wouldn't sleep on Chris Moore also. I think there's going to be competition there with him and Zay Jones. You're probably going to keep 5 receivers. The question becomes, usually your 4th or 5th receiver have to play special teams. So who knows how that's going to play out. But you're right. The depth is there. The toughest thing with injuries, like you said, is if some guy misses a bunch of games, or if you get multiple injuries at a certain position, like the Cardinals had the 1 year with the offensive line a couple seasons ago. Then last year on the defensive line was just, guys rotating and revolving all around. So you need to keep your units together. But I think there's even, while we have questions about the defense, I think it's looking to be like there's pretty good depth there too on the defensive side. So this is going to be a very intriguing team, I think, just to watch and see how it does, play out. But I think overall that overriding aspect, which I alluded to with the offense and, guys not worrying about getting the ball, the character of these players that they are so strong about getting is win first guys, guys that want to win. Their team first, I guess, is a better way of saying it. And those are the type of guys that they're consistently going after. And when you build that on, how many times we heard the word culture in the last 18 months?
The price of admission. And they really are when it comes down to the core, they're trying to build teams the way the Patriots have done it. And like if you remember hearing what Tom Brady said at the Patriots Ring of Honor Hall of Fame, and it's all about team. And like it doesn't matter. It's like football is so team oriented. It doesn't matter how good you are if you are not. And I believe that's what the Cardinals are purposely building. And so perhaps when you've got super athletic players who are very talented, like Isaiah Simmons or Marco Wilson, who just didn't quite fit because maybe they cared a touch more about what their role was as opposed to how it fit in with the team. Not to say anything but it seems like they, especially with James Conner, they cleansed the roster. And like, who are the guys that they seem then, that quietly disappeared. So you got Isaiah Simmons gone, you've got Marco Wilson gone, Hollywood Brown. So like are those the guys that they cleansed, or was it back of the roster guys? I don't know, but they really have put together a roster of players that really believe in being a team, and I think as long as there is progress in wins, that will continue to work like it has so long for the Patriots, which, and all the other element to that is good quarterback play. And if you get great quarterback play and you have, unselfish players, that's a recipe. That is always a recipe for success in the NFL.
Not about it. I mean, it is pretty simple, right? And that level, and it is the ultimate team sport. But it still comes down. You always hear guys, and Austin Ford said it a couple of times. You always hear coaches and personnel guys say it, is that most games will come down to 4 or 5 plays. Obviously, there's a lot of plays in a game, but they'll come down to 4 or 5 plays, either 4 or 5 plays that you made or 4 or 5 plays you didn't make. And when you have the number that blew me away when I saw it last year is we all know there's about 50% plus, somewhere in that 50 to mid-50s of games that are decided by 1 score or less. But the number that blew me away, Jess, was that there are close, on average, of between 70 and 75% of NFL games are 1-score games at some point in the fourth quarter.
Yeah.
And when you have that, well, the teams that are good find a way to win at least the majority of those games. I mean, look at the Vikings, right? 2 seasons ago, they were 11-0.
They were amazing in close games. That's fluky good. Like the thing about that is like you can control that a little bit, but it also is statistically improbable to be well above average in close games.
And then last year, I don't know what the record was, but it wasn't that. It wasn't as good. And all of a sudden, and granted, Kirk Cousins got hurt after about halfway through the season, but they didn't win those close games, and they weren't a playoff team. And in this league, when the difference between making the play, I mean, think of it this way. I mean, if you win 7, right, yeah, you're 7-10, you're under 500. It's not horrible, but it's not good enough. All you got to do is find a way to win 3 of those that you lost, and all of a sudden you're at 10. And there's probably 3 games in there that you were right there at the end, and ended up either you didn't make a play or the other team did, and boom, you lost that game. That's how fine a line it is in the NFL, and I think sometimes many lose sight of that.
And with that, we will end this second edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web for this week. We will return here soon with Seth Cox. We've got our divisional ranking show coming up in the next few weeks. We've also got a number of opponent preview shows, and if there's anything else that comes up, I'm sure Seth and I or Howard and I will get you that off-season NFL content. That's Howard Balzer. I'm Jess Rude. This is the Rise Up C-Red podcast. We'll be back again soon. Thank you for listening as always.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise up Sea Red.